Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. We respectfully advise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that this podcast contains the name of a deceased Aboriginal person. In this episode of Birds of a Feather, Narelle Austen explores the lives of Commandant Purcell, Commandant Skottowe and the convict artist Richard Browne. Against the background of the harsh realities of Newcastle's Coal River settlement, Narelle delves into the unlikely collaboration between convicts, officials and the local Awabakal people. How, in this first decade, did this punishment outpost become a place of artistic, scientific and literary production? Stay with us as we bring history to life.
Let's begin with a brief summary of the situation in the early penal settlement, widely known as Coal River, at the beginning of the second decade of the 19th century. In 1810, Commandant Purcell began his time at Newcastle as an enthusiastic man whose head was full of projects for the betterment of the settlement and therefore himself. It was not an easy assignment. As well as the supervision, agricultural production, and feeding and housing and control of the convicts and soldiers, Purcell took on the construction of the new wharf, built more lime kilns, and organised the building of the first boat to be fully constructed in Newcastle. Commandant Purcell knew that by building a boat, he would be able to increase the potential to transport coal, timber, and lime to satisfy Governor Macquarie's building projects in the colony. The operation of pirates, often with the collaboration of convicts and soldiers, required a locally available sea-going vessel to pursue them. The boat would also enable the pursuit of any convicts who commandeered visiting vessels for their escape from Coal River settlement. Vessels in distress were a constant problem, which is recorded in the number of ships wrecked on the coast as they tried to enter the dangerous waters of the settlement at the confluence of Hunters River and the Pacific Ocean. Additional navigational dangers were caused by the constantly moving sandbanks, choppy waters, and rocks around Nobby Island. Due to the colony-wide infestation of wheat crops and consequent lack of food supplies, Purcell allowed convicts to cultivate their own gardens and rear their own poultry and pigs. He therefore made another significant step towards self-sufficiency for the settlement. But how could he make a record of the positive things he had accomplished? This was the essential question that commandants and governors had to face. Purcell was not able to find anyone to promote his works for posterity. However, succeeding commandants made this a priority and are well remembered as a result. Killing two birds with one stone, they would also promote themselves as officials whose name and family would be remembered in the hallowed halls of science and the Admiralty. This great unexplored and unexploited southern land, terra incognita, was of significant scientific, economic, and therefore political interest. The British concern with the natural sciences was exemplified by the presence of Joseph Banks on board Captain Cook's Endeavour in 1770. He was president of the Royal Society for 41 years, during which time he sent botanists all over the world to collect plants which were grown in Kew Gardens and became the basis for research, international exhibitions, and scientific prestige for Britain. Banks advocated British settlement in New South Wales and the colonisation of Australia through the establishment of Botany Bay as a solution for the overflowing British prisons and to promote colonisation of the far-off continent through the utilisation of convict labour. For decades, Banks advised the British government on all Australian matters. He's credited with introducing the eucalyptus, acacia, and the genus named after him, Banksia, to the Western world, amongst many other achievements. Despite the inappropriate recommendation to the Admiralty in Joseph Banks's glowing report on Botany Bay some 20 years earlier, his involvement illustrates an early and significant interest in all things botanical in the exploration of the Pacific. Most British ships of exploration had diarists, botanists, and artists on board. British captains also kept meticulous records, as did the Dutch and the French. Ironically, Captain Arthur Phillip decided, after exploring Botany Bay and environs by boat, that the area was not appropriate. The harbour was too shallow for shipping, it did not have good fresh water source, and the soil was poor. And so, with the Frenchman La Pérouse close by, Arthur Phillip sailed on, into one of the most beautiful harbours in the world, and with his sights firmly fixed on his flag, he claimed the land for Britain. This interest was not only scientific, but also political and, of course, economic. Exploration was a very expensive business, occurred over a considerable amount of time, given the distances involved, and the risk of losses was very high. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the coal-fed beast of the Industrial Revolution was more and more voracious. Their British pits would not be able to satisfy the increasing demands for private consumption and James Watt's steam engines. Who knew what other bounty might lie beneath the soil, growing on the land or flying in the skies in these far-off lands? Africa had had to give up its diamonds. South America had its mythical El Dorado and silver mines, and the now-named Afghanistan had been exporting lapis lazuli, its semi-precious blue stone, for thousands of years. The National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, England, has a vast collection of geological samples from the four corners of the globe, which were traded by the British seafarers. Cook's voyage in the 1770s to the Pacific Islands brought scientific information, breadfruit, and other sources of food and herbal medicine back to the expanding cities and museums of Britain. In Australia, there were salt pans offering an essential element for the preservation of food, which was especially useful for the long voyages of the Navy and merchant ships. The settlement at Norfolk Island was established to fell the tall pine trees once believed to be useful for masts for British ships due to their tall, straight trunks. They could also obtain flax, which was used on the ships as rope, used for sails, baskets, and cheap clothing. Countless animals, fish, birds, and insects were collected for examination on the other side of the world. In the British Natural History Museum in London, between a portrait of Joseph Banks as a young man and a marble bust of his more venerable self, there is a description of the long association between natural history, exploration, and, by extension, colonialism. We read that European natural scientists went on voyages in the Pacific to study plants and animals, often using the knowledge of the local people. They collected specimens of everything they saw, classifying them according to European methods in an effort to understand the world. Given the fragile nature of the actual specimens, frequency of shipwrecks, and the tyranny of time and distance, how are the British to rely on physical samples for information about this unimaginable cornucopia? And more importantly for them as businessmen, to invest in its exploitation. Here we return to the work of the literate elite, which included governors, officials, scientists, ministers, explorers, and free settlers. A minority of soldiers and convicts who wrote private and official colonial letters, memoirs, manuscripts, songs, and poems describe the landscape and its beauty in ink and on parchment. But how were they to have more accessible and palpable records of their endeavours? Here we come to the importance of visual artists. Our rare birds, jailbirds, these birds of a feather who came together here at Coal River, Newcastle, Australia. Despite the recording inconsistencies of the convict indents, the authorities knew that there were some artists who had been transported for forgery and counterfeiting. They were usually lithographers, engravers, and painters who could be utilised to contribute to the aggrandizement of the efforts of the authorities, their patrons, and the convicts themselves. These visual artists could serve the private passions of their patrons and their own need for protection, remuneration, and publication. This route to preferential treatment was not always an easy one, as we've discovered in the previous podcast regarding the unfortunate life of William Harrison Craig in the lime-burning pits at Newcastle. Other artists were more fortunate, however. In 1811, Richard Browne, a Dublin-born convict, arrived in the Sydney colony on the transport ship Providence. In under a year, in October, he was sent to Newcastle Secondary Punishment Settlement for forgery, where he remained until February 1817. In the same year as Richard Browne's arrival, 1811, young Commandant Skottowe was transferred to Newcastle Penal Settlement to relieve Commandant Purcell. He brought with him what was to become obvious to all later, his passion for nature. Using convicts and local knowledge in Newcastle, he located, collected, and preserved specimens of birds, butterflies, plants, and fish. His aim was to produce visual evidence which could be appreciated by the Royal Academy and so induce other scientists, artists, and free settlers to come and explore the area. In so doing, he would promote himself as one of the officials whose name and family would be remembered in the annals of science and art. Commandant Thomas Skottowe co-opted Browne to create the botanical sketches and detailed drawings of various specimens which he had collected. Richard Browne worked with Skottowe to produce the illustrated manuscript entitled Specimens from Nature of the Birds, Animals, and etc. of New South Wales, collected and arranged by Thomas Skottowe, Esquire, the drawings by T.R. Browne, New South Wales, Newcastle, 1813. It has been suggested that the convict Richard Browne had some training in botanical drawing. Browne may have been related to Dr. Patrick Browne, 1720-1790, who was an Irish natural historian, as his ability to draw birds, reptiles, fish, and butterflies suggests some professional association with that natural history circle. Confusingly, Browne signed his botanical illustrations in a variety of ways. We do know that he remained at Newcastle for 6 years and worked as an artist with Commandants Skottowe, Thompson, and Wallace in their endeavours. The Sydney publisher, Absalom West, included 2 engravings of Newcastle by Walter Preston in Views of New South Wales, based on Browne's work. Skottowe's botanical manuscript includes the Aboriginal names of the local flora and fauna. This might suggest cooperation between artists, commandants, and the local people. During this time, some artists, including Browne, continued their interest and illustration of Indigenous people and their culture in the colony. In Neil Gunson's scholarly entry in the Dictionary of Australian Artists online, there is the following critique of Browne's early work. Browne's animal studies, perhaps due to the strangeness of Australia's mammalia, are less than expert, while his early Aboriginal figure subjects are ill-formed and amateurish compared with his natural history subjects. The evolution of Browne's figure work is revealing. He obviously became increasingly fascinated by the local Aboriginal people. An 1817 study of Broken Bay Jemmy, although still surrounded by the black and yellow frame with which he encased his natural history illustrations, already shows a growing maturity in figure drawing from the earliest work, employing a more exaggerated caricature style. During his 6 years as a convict in Newcastle, Browne was to see Commandants Skottowe, Thompson, and Wallace. In the relatively small settlement at Newcastle, he coincided with the convict artists Walter Preston, an engraver, Joseph Lycett, a watercolourist, and the unfortunate young William Craig, portrait artist. Other talented convicts who survived and prospered in various ways included John Tucker and James Hardy-Voe. In the following podcasts, we will reveal the lives and works of convicts whose various skills and artistic achievements provide invaluable evidence of the presence of people and their cultural practices, the local landscape, and the architectural development of the early penal settlement in colonial Newcastle at a crucial time in our history. These artefacts resulted from the unique moment in time when there was, serendipitously, initial collaboration between First Nations people, a few privileged convicts, Commandant Skottowe, Thompson and Wallace, and Governor Macquarie.
That's it for this episode of Birds of a Feather. We've journeyed through the ambitions of commandants, the resilience of convict artists, and the early colonial fascination with natural history. In our upcoming episodes, we'll continue to reveal the lives and works of other convict artists whose skills preserved invaluable records of Newcastle's past. If you've enjoyed today's episode, or any of our podcasts, give us a like, leave a comment, or share with others. And if you haven't already, you can also follow us on Newcastle Family History Society Podcasts.